Take us away.
Absolutely. Well, thanks everyone for joining today. My name is Chris Marshall. I'm a positioning engineer at Frontier SI. I'm here today to talk to you about some technical stuff, specifically about the SBAS and some precise positioning for surveyors. So thanks, Roche, for the opportunity, and thanks to FIG for the opportunity to present today at the 6th FIG Young Surveyors Conference. So thanks everyone for joining. A little bit of background about myself to start. So yeah, I'm currently a positioning engineer at Frontier SI. Before that, I've had a whole bunch of other jobs. I think many of us, wear many hats before we get through university and all the rest of it. But started off as a retail vendor many years ago, doing basically running around serving food to people. After a while, I, was driving cars around, delivering pharmaceuticals to people. Got through university, eventually got to the stage where I was demonstrating classes. I actually really loved teaching at university level and came through that stuff. Alongside that, I was a surveyor's assistant. Never in my wildest dreams at those stages did I really consider that I would end up as an engineer doing such really exciting work as I'm currently doing, working across spatial, space, and a bunch of other sectors. So it was really interesting to hear Alan Duffy speaking just before about sort of the current state of affairs in the Earth observation space. Really, really exciting stuff. Frontier SI, we do some work in Earth observation as well, but very much that the ecosystem and the space industry is just on the up and up at the moment. There's so much development happening. In the last few years alone, all these new services are popping up. I think it's a really, really exciting time to be in space, spatial, all the other related things. So anyway, my story with university, as many people, starts off, it's a bit of a rocky road. I started off doing mechatronics engineering, actually. So I was very much interested in electronics engineering, physics, maths, programming, computers, all that stuff. I really, really enjoyed the physics, the maths, the science parts of it. Didn't get on that well with some of the electronics engineering parts. So actually at university, discovered a class called Applications of GIS. Turns out there are many applications of GIS, and it sort of was a bit of a career shift for me. After that, I discovered surveying, started working as a surveyor, started looking at GIS, ended up getting an undergraduate and a master's degree, both in spatial. So now I'm a qualified engineer working at a company doing engineering work in spatial. It's really exciting for me. So over the last few years, I've been working on a project called the Satellite-Based Augmentation System for Australia and New Zealand, which is basically a new system to improve GPS quality. So that's kind of what I was going to speak to mostly about today. I'll touch on a few other little bits and pieces, but I'm sure many of you are familiar with GPS, GNSS technology. It's become ubiquitous, and honestly, it's quite a ridiculous offering. If you consider 15, 20 years ago, GPS technology was available, but it was selectively available. Governments like the US was turning off signal components to make it worse quality. We're getting 20 meters, 30 meters GPS accuracy all the time. Nowadays, it's fairly ubiquitous to get sort of sub-meter accuracy or even better. So one of the ways we can deliver that is through a satellite-based augmentation system. So SBAS, satellite-based augmentation system, supports wide area or regional augmentation to satellite signals using broadcast messages. The long and short of it is it improves the quality of the GPS position you're able to get. It improves it in a number of ways, but accuracy is probably the main way that most surveyors would care about. So it does so by basically having a ground station network, as you can sort of see in this diagram, a whole bunch of places around a nation or a network that are very highly surveyed. You know where the core stations are. They're observing the GPS satellites at all times. If they know their position very well, it's highly well surveyed, and they have an observation, and the observation doesn't match where the surveyed position of the locations are, you can work out sort of a network offset based on the current state of the GPS networks, also other constellations, not just GPS. So computing all that information from a network, sending it through a central processing center, and then bouncing off a geostationary satellite allows you to actually transmit those same corrections down to the users on the ground, and they can actually correct for common sources of error in the GPS signal. In this case, it's mainly ionosphere that SBAS L1 will actually handle. So this is not something new in the world. In fact, WAAS or WAS, the US system, was the first one to be developed. That's been around for about 15 to 20 years now, first one in the world. Since then, there's been a new SBAS developed in Europe, EGNOS. There's currently operational one in Japan, MSAS. There's one in Guyana in India as well, which is, I think, mostly developed. I think it's currently in use, but seeing some expansions. And if you're in the little bottom right here, you might see a new one, SouthPan. That's the new satellite-based augmentation system that's being developed for Australia and New Zealand. So we originally first applied for a test bed for SBS technology in 2014. At the time, we actually couldn't really justify it based on the sort of the breakdown of how it was done. SBS is inherently an aviation technology. There was initially just looked at the aviation sector. How can we help, airplanes, aerodromes, airports, approaches to landing, that sort of thing using SBS. But the government decided that it wasn't worth investing in if there was only benefits to the aviation sector. However, since the inception of SBS and once it was initially available, they couldn't put any authentication on this thing. If you're landing a plane on a runway, you don't want to be logging into a system as you're landing. So open service was the name of the game. That ground users quickly found us. They quickly started using it for various applications that were never intended by the aviation users. So since then, it was expanded to many other use cases. And in 2016, the Australian governments both put some money and actually started this process, the SBS technology for the Australia New Zealand region, and trying to see what benefits we could get from building one. So that happened between 2017 and 2019. A massive group of organizations was involved. I'll try and keep this, I know we're running a little bit behind time, but ultimately Frontier SI was engaged to run an industry demonstration projects with 27 projects across 10 sectors of industry using an operational SBS technology that we had stood up for the purposes of testing and working out the economic benefits. So we tested all these industries. We worked with multiple partners. We put the satellite technology in the hands of people who actually knew what they were doing, who could basically apply them to these sectors. They trialed it, they gave back reports and results, and all of that was then sort of built up into an economics benefits picture, which we then developed to government. So, I mean, within that sort of space, it's worth noting that the way we're doing these things isn't quite the same as the existing systems around the world. What you're seeing up the top here, the Generation 1 SBS, that's actually the same system that's been stood up other places in the world, WAS, EGNOS, MSAS, all the rest. But some of the implementations of SBS around the world are doing things a little bit differently. In fact, in our implementation, we looked at 3 services. There was L1 SBS, which is the traditional standard signal. We had dual frequency.
Hey, Chris.
Which is, yes.
Do you mind if I just ask you to mute and then unmute yourself? I'm just having a bit of trouble hearing you.
Okay, is that better?
I still can't hear you.
Interesting. Apologies. Is that any better?
Before though, so I'm not sure. No, if the audience can hear you fine, all good. Please continue.
It's all fine. They can hear me. Okay. Yeah, I think I'm having some permissions issue in the browser, but oh well. If you guys can hear me, it's all good. Thank you. Anyway, I'll try and speed through this, but suffice to say, Australia, we're kind of doing some new things in our implementation. We've got not just a standard single frequency SBS, we're actually been testing the world's first implementation of a dual frequency SBS using GPS and Galileo, so the European system and the US system, as well as a service, so a satellite delivered PPP signal. So PPP is a little bit different ballgame to the other 2 signals. It has a convergence time, namely, which is 30 to 40 minutes at the start, where you have to sort of converge down from, say, 1 to 0.5 to 2 meters accuracy. After that 30 minutes of convergence, you actually get down to a decimeter level, so 10 centimeters horizontally. And due to the nature of satellite geometry and all the rest, the vertical component's about 1.5 to 2 times as bad as that. So the PPP offering here is around 10 centimeters horizontally, about 15 to 20 vertically. So all of these are open source, sorry, not open source, open service, as in they're available to anyone who can use it and who has the right hardware to pick it up. Specifically, the L1 SBS, the top one here, will be the most widely accessible because you don't need any special hardware, anything specific, anything new at all. In fact, you have an existing standard GNSS receiver. In many cases, you can just send a firmware update through, tell it to what satellite number the SBS will be looking at, turn on some settings, and you'll be able to get down to that sub-meter or so accuracy. So Generation 1 SBS is definitely the most compatible across sort of the equipment market currently. So, but why would you use this? So, as I mentioned, improved free-to-air accuracy without requiring extra hardware, standard L1 frequency. The resulting improvements, you get better data, you get better accuracy. And if using PPP, that's just a service that was never available for free before. Previously, you could buy a PPP service, there's global ones available, but being offered by the Australian New Zealand government as a public good offering, that's kind of new. So, as a result of that sort of economic benefits activity we did with Ernst & Young in New Zealand, we ended up with some fairly significant findings, $7.6 billion projected across 30 years to both the Australian and New Zealand economies. I think the major beneficiaries were, I think, the agriculture industry, the resources industry, road industry, construction industry, a few other ones. If you're interested to find out a bit more about these, I have a link to a report in a moment that kind of breaks down these categories a bit more. But overall, the tagline figures here, $6.2 billion is to the Australian economy alone in the next 30 years, was enough for the Australian and New Zealand governments to jointly engage into a procurement process to build this system for Australia and New Zealand. So very exciting. We're actually going to get an SBAS. That's been actually the case since 2020. I believe the tender was announced for this SBAS system. And that's the current state we're at. The system's gone out for tender. Geoscience Australia and Land Information New Zealand are working very closely with a bunch of vendors who are bidding on the system. And I'll speak more about that a bit later on, but suffice to say, SBAS is on its way for the region. Of course, some of the international viewers may already have an SBAS available in your area, be that Europe or otherwise. Anyway, I'll skip through some of this stuff. I've actually been involved in not only sort of the test bed side of things, but also doing some of my own standalone testing with the SBAS over the last little while. And one of the things that I was looking at in this instance is sort of a test that's sort of analogous to what a surveyor might do if you're trying to do a GNSS survey, you're trying to capture a feature on the ground. This isn't potentially like the most rigorous way to do it, but this is a quick and easy way to do it, perhaps. So the equipment setup I'm going to use for this demonstration is basically two SBAS-enabled GNSS receivers in a backpack, split through a passive signal splitter into the same antenna. So all of the receivers here are seeing the same exact signals. I've also got a third receiver in there, which is a sort of a survey grade or geodetic grade antenna, receiver that I'm using for post-processing of the solution. So basically, I'm using one very, very high quality receiver to post-process and get a high level of certainty about my result. And then I'm comparing it to a real-time SBAS and a real-time standalone GPS solution. So for this environment, I was working around Docklands Park in Melbourne, capturing all these three receivers and then kind of comparing them. So I'll just skip through a little bit. Did two tests here I'll kind of show really quickly, point averaging and a line capture test. The point averaging is looking at a concrete pad, which I'll show you. So black underlying polygon you're seeing here is basically generated from the post-process data. That's the best guess that I have on the actual location of this thing. You'll see the base map is misaligned, but that's just the nature of Google Maps. Anyway, the reference polygon measured up about 16.4 square meters. If we were looking at this exact polygon, and what I did with this was take a receiver and put it on each corner of this pad for 30 seconds, point average those 30 seconds of data, and put in the locations. 5 minutes to go. I'll very much speed through. Sorry, Rush. I know we're running late. Suffice to say, with SBAS on, the estimate was 15.9. With SBAS off, it was 14.5. So you get a lot closer to the actual true value by not having that error on each corner of the pad. Similarly, if this is a walking test, you can see in the top left here, started walking, go counterclockwise around this sort of track here. The orange line is the SBAS off, the green line is the SBAS on. As you go around some corners, do some kinematic movements, sort of things, the SBAS will stay much more closely coupled to the reference trajectory than your SBAS off standalone GNSS will. In fact, here it's converged by, I think, 2.5 meters vertically, 1 meter horizontally. SBAS on maintained 20 centimeters horizontal. So that's a very good result from SBAS. I probably don't have time to show this whole thing, but suffice to say, this doesn't just apply to a walking test. This is a driving test around the Formula One track in Melbourne, not on a Formula One car, unfortunately. Using some basically fairly low cost receiver hardware. You can see that using the SBAS, you achieved about a 48 centimeter horizontal error around this entire course, about 70 vertical. So this is pretty ideal. This car makes a really nice ground plane for an antenna, but it's very interesting for perhaps a road survey or anything you were trying to do over a large area without getting out of the vehicle. You're still getting that sub-meter accuracy. Noting at the last time. Okay, if you don't have access to some of the equipment that we're using for those things, of course, we're also interested in making sure SBAS will be available to sort of anyone who wants to use it. So we actually developed a sort of an open source recipe, if you will, to build your own SBAS receiver. If you're interested, the website on the screen here has the details. Yeah, there's a documentation package that I put together here so you can sort of build your own. It doesn't require a huge amount of skills. You have to be able to solder. You have to be able to have access to a 3D printer at some stage. In Melbourne, that's quite easy. Our local libraries actually have 3D printers. So that's where I printed this one. And yeah, a little bit of componentry maybe cost a little bit more depending where you are. Might be a little bit difficult to get, but a variation on this recipe will definitely get you there. So this has been seen testing in a whole bunch of different places, a whole bunch of different applications, tractors, roads. It's been on some ships. It's been used for survey equipment, all that stuff. So a lot of the work I was done speaking about this SBED was kind of written up into a series of reports, all of it also available on our website. EY Economic Benefit Report is the main one. That's 300 pages. It's got a very nice executive summary if you're looking for your specific sector of industry, and it'll kind of break down what are the benefits of that sort of thing. Technical report is maybe for people who are a bit more interested in the actual hands-on testing, how it was done and how results were gained. Of course, if you, one thing you might notice from before is I was talking about a continuously operating reference station network. So if you have a reference station network existing, what else can you do with it? It's kind of another point here. We have a very significant network around Australia and New Zealand. I'm sure this is the same elsewhere in the world. We're very lucky in Australia and in New Zealand that we have an additional infrastructure called NPIC, National Positioning Infrastructure Capability, which allows us to then leverage those cores sites and get down to that 3 to 5 centimeter service using RTK. So basically all of those same ground stations are then N-trip endpoints, so you can connect up with an RTK compatible receiver, get a 3 to 5 centimeter service. So overall, this sort of big picture is with SBAS available with down to 10 centimeter PPP, as well as this high accuracy core network, this widely distributed network of GNSS sites, getting that 3 to 5 centimeter service. Basically, you can do really high accuracy work anywhere in the country, depending on what your needs are. Yeah, as I was mentioning earlier, SouthPan is the name of our new SBAS. It's not fully announced yet. We're still working through the sort of the probity. There's still a whole bunch of concerns, a whole bunch of process being done behind the scenes with Australia and New Zealand to work out who the vendor is going to be. But if you sign up to Geoscience Australia, you'll get the latest word when it happens. We're expecting some sort of signal to be online in 2021 and available for aviation around 2025. Anyway, that's me. Thank you very much for listening. There's a very, very lightning run through some of the SBAS and some of the benefits that I'll actually have for survey work. Didn't touch too much on particular use cases, but if there's any questions or you guys would like to know anything specific, please do jump in the Q&A and let me know. Otherwise, yeah, well, thanks for listening, basically. I believe Rosh had a couple other things she was going to put in for the remainder of the session, but I might have eaten up all of the time available. We'll see. I think there's something dropped in the Q&A. How much affordable to use SBAS technology? Would you please mention types when SBAS is extremely important? Okay, so how much equipment is available that can use SBAS? I'm taking that as the question. Well, a wide array of currently available receivers. This is basically the L1 SBAS. If you can, I think many major manufacturers of receiver, all of your major survey regarded brands, as well as many of the currently off the shelf. In fact, there's a link available on our website. We have a table on the Frontier side website that says exactly which compatible receivers were tested with the Australian New Zealand system. So it's not they're going to be the same depending where around the world, but different equipment will be slightly different upgrade paths. In many cases, it's just a firmware upgrade that you need, or otherwise to just get into your device and configure it to look at the right PRN number for the SBAS. Sorry, it's a bit of a depends question there, Shakti. I think Rosh is coming and going as she's doing a bunch of other things, facilitating these sessions today. If there are any more questions for me, please drop them in the Q&A. I'll see what I can do. Absolutely. Okay, I think the next session is starting now. So if you haven't figured out the navigation yet, jump on the left side of the screen, hit the sessions, and we'll go on to the mentoring soft skills for the industry globally in the coming years. Thank you all for joining me for this short session, and yeah, feel free to get in touch if you want to learn a bit more about SBAS.
My screen. Right. Thank you for waiting for me. And welcome to my session. I'm so glad that I had the opportunity of having Priya Gandhi kick off the session earlier on, which brings me to the next session on reflective practices as a young surveyor and how we can use these practices to reimagine a sustainable future. The purpose of my presentation has two objectives. We want to document the value of connecting past to present and future, And the second is to share how surveyors can treat experiences and stories through the reflective practices. And this inspiration has come about when I was reading one of these documentaries about the Egypt pyramid and how it was built and why it was built and what life in Egypt was like. And one of the fascinating things about this was the Pythagorean theorem was not present during that time. And there was a lot of cognitive social values that were placed. So a lot of the things that were done in Egypt was based on this social structure. But more importantly, it was a way of life that helped them build how the Egypt pyramids today are. And what we do realize about these pyramids is if you look at the landmass at which it is located, each point of the pyramid is actually pointing to the center. And it took approximately 20 years with 20,000 people to build it, which tells a story of the wealth and the slavery, the history of the mythologies of why it was used as a tomb and the spiritual beliefs that these people had. And there were other parts of this pyramid which reflected it to be used as a power plant, something to similar what we currently are using. And the structure itself is so fascinating because it holds a lot of the mathematical or the geometric and geometric values of it. And when we look at the significance of these events of not just Egypt, but throughout the world, we see how there has been a difference in the changes in the way that we have been documenting boundaries and why boundaries are important and how it has revolved over the time. And one of the things that we do realize in each of this land ownership is the life that people are living, which is so important. So more than just building boundaries or recording them in real time, even with technology, there is a need to understand what the life is, what these social values are. And I do believe that even Ellen, when he was speaking, he recognized the custodians of the land that he was on. And when we recognize such values, we are able to appreciate how the history has been changing itself. So when we look at the life in Egypt, we see that there was a social status of how the hierarchies were moving. And one of the most significant parts about these hierarchies is we see that we had the pharaoh, and then we had the free citizens from blocks 1 to the scripts and to the peasant farmers. And then we have the servants and the slaves. And in this stories that we see on the social classes, we understand that the way that the farmers and the workers were able to own land was quite different to the ways that the servants and the slaves were using it. So there was a lot of symbolic values placed in here, and we see that throughout history is there's a lot of relationship to the symbolic values of why people documented things the way that they did. And often when we look at something as symbolic as Egypt with their drawings and the scripts and their parables that they used, we notice that a similar pattern currently exists as well. And there is an importance of understanding what these relationships actually mean. And the other thing that we find so interesting about this society is we know that it was a very deserted area, but they were located along the Nile River, which made them use the seasons of when the flood waters would go into the land, leave silt, and then the residues would go back and use that silt as a product for agriculture. And because there was no system of money, they would use these products that they have and trade them among people. And why is such information so important is because a lot of these traditional practices of using the silt may have been lost over time, especially when we are talking about how do we preserve or use a lot of the traditional methods in modern agriculture or modern livelihoods, or even of how we are building our infrastructure. Now, the other thing that we can learn from Egypt is the way that they would make their houses. And with Egypt, one of the most interesting things was the temperatures would range from anywhere from 0 degrees at the coolest to 50 degrees to the warmest. And the way that these people would build their houses is north facing, so that the doors, when it opened, the winds would come in and it would cool off the structure. And the way that they would position their kitchens and their prayer rooms and their bedrooms were all a system of mitigating a lot of this climatic environments. So they were using a lot of knowledge and traditional ways of doing things to protect their livelihoods and the patterns at which they were living. Now, the other interesting thing about Egypt is the children and the adults for breakfast and dinner would have beer as a it was interesting because the Nile River was actually used for a sewage system, which made it undrinkable. So it was quite easier for them to give their children something more healthier than the Nile River that they were using. Another reason that Nile River was so significant is that river was also used for bathing, but they would avoid it at many instances because of the different animals and the hippos and the crocodiles that they would live. And so, when we look at Egypt as a whole, we see it as a context. We see it under the context of why did people not have a lot of furniture in the ancient times in Egypt? Perhaps a lot of forests were not around, so they could not make use of the wood, and wood was very expensive there. So, what I'm trying to get is while I'm telling you the stories, I'm actually connecting it back to a context. I'm connecting it back to why were things happening as they are, and why were people using what they were using. It's not only about documenting facts, but the reason behind it and the values behind it. So we see this information into our land tenure systems and as humanitarian actors, about the system of ownership, not only in Egypt, but the other parts of the countries like Rome and England. And we see that there is a common pattern that we see. There was a lot of conquests that were happening right from the beginning. There was a lot of stewardship as land was collectively owned. Even in the Pacific, we had people who would own land collectively, and they would hold land as a steward of the resources, which is quite different to what we have as privatization. There was a lot of resemblance of slavery in Rome and in England and Egypt, and this started as the human rights activists came into the play. And then from this social system, which earlier existed, that only if you were born by blood to a particular class, then only you would be able to live free or be in a royal livelihood, slowly started to change to a class system where it started to become more about you are able to earn, you're no longer under the slave system, which plays a very important role in the way that we currently do the activities that we do, because it brings about the knowledge about why these things, it is important. So when it comes to all of this, there's connections that we have to the technology that we currently use in documenting, we do still understand that a lot of areas are not as well defined as the other countries that are more Western in nature. And therefore, we need to start becoming more active in using traditional methods or learning about traditional methods in trying to identify where the boundaries are. And the other reason it is so important is a lot of archaeological evidences can be used to go back to really finding evidence on where the boundaries really are in case of conflicts. And that has been rising in the last years as well. So when we look at the topic of what we do as surveyors, we are so blessed to see a connection from our surveying to the land rights, to the resource use, even to taxes and human resources and respecting rights, to security and the Western and traditional systems, to implementation, to the laws. And we see how this one small role that we have that often is underlooked has a big play in the greater audience. So that brings me to to my favorite TV shows that I'm currently watching, because we are in lockdown, and when I do feel I need to see a series, so it's pretty awesome. It's timeless. It's not based on real events, anyways. But one of the beautiful things about this series is, so there's three people, and they would go back in time, and they would like to, because there's this evil person, Flynn, who's going back to mess up the time, and these three people are trying to protect that from happening. And when he was doing that, it was quite interesting to see that in one of the episodes they visited this person, Dr. Rebina von Braun, and he was the most important rocket developers, and we heard Ellen Duffy talk about him, and how he played also a major role in NASA. But when we talk about history, if these people did not exist, if these people did not have the opportunities or went into those stressful situations that they went through, or the experiences that they went through, they would not have been able to make what they did. So every experience in history had a role to play in what we have today. And that is why when we look at history, when we look at things that are happening even today, it is not about the logic of how things ought to be, but what happened and why did it happen. And that really helps us put everything into context, especially when we look at land law, or when we look at traditional practices that are being used. And when we see this resemblance, we notice how what was traditionally present was actually beneficial. And it is not only about what, but why. Why did it happen the way that it did? And that is the reason that we bring about this conversation about reflective practices, because we have a story to tell to the future communities, and we tell the stories more than just assumptions, but based on evidences, based on real context, based on why things are as they are. So just looking at this diagram, we see that there is actually a double loop learning that happens when we start taking on a reflective practice in our work. And we move away on, why did we do what we do and what we did, or what we got, and then bringing it back on why did we do, or why did certain things happen the way that this happened. So the reason that I felt it was very important to share this is because, I'm sorry, I forgot to introduce myself because I was late. I could not get in line. But the reason I needed to share this was the VCSB is currently preparing a knowledge portal. And these reflective practices are the tools that every young surveyor who's volunteering with FIG, they have an opportunity to being with communities, learning about their traditional practices, and bringing this knowledge back to VCSB as a platform to learn from one another on how different communities are using the knowledge, or what are some new knowledge that can be generated from it. So it brings us back to how are we sharing this knowledge, and how do we write these reflections? So when we go to a reflection, this model was developed by Peter Pappas, and he just made a taxonomy of it in the different levels. When we encounter something, we remember it, we try to understand it, and then we apply how do we use the knowledge that we've currently owned into a real life context? How do we analyze this? And then we evaluate it, and then we create something new. Because as human, we are very cognitive in nature. And if you go back to what I was talking about in Egypt, these people were cognitive, social as well. They would use knowledge that they currently have, whether they were as farmers, and whatever they were using in the field, because in their free time, these Egyptian farmers would go and make that pyramid. So they were not only responsible for making the pyramids, they were also farmers, and in their free time, they would make this pyramid, which actually played a very important role. So what does it mean to be a cognitive social person? It means whenever we learn new knowledge, we are instantly able to apply this to our context close to home. And even as I'm speaking, I'm sure many of you have been able to apply certain of your knowledge with something that you may have seen in Egypt, or if you were there, or if you knew of a story that you came. We as cognitive people are able to then bring in new experiences in the way that we are leading for the future to bring about sustainable practices, because our why of why things happened the way that it did starts to filter the things that are relevant with the things that are not so relevant in the stages. So The 4 ways that we learn is, we need to start reflecting on our experiences and start documenting them and start writing it. And the second thing we need to do is to create conversations. Every reflection that we do cannot be valuable if we are not sharing it with one another. Often I would sit with my husband and he would share an idea, and he's not a person with tenure at all, but the questions that he raises sometimes makes me think more, and I'm like, I didn't see it in that perspective. Thank you for raising that up. Even though he's a full-on IT person, and his conversation really bores me down. But we need to create a community as part of this VCSP to get into small groups, to create conversations. And even as young surveyors, when you're documenting this information, you're able to put it online, and that you're able to share with the wider audience, who gives us a responsibility to be more accountable, to be more transparent, and to be critical on the ways that we've been thinking, and to be shaped better. And then, of course, it creates opportunities to practice. Everything that we are learning, we're able to put into practice and able to get better performances. And then the last thing is we are able to put that in practice and challenge experiences. So we have a legacy to live. We have a legacy to showcase, not only for this generation, but for the future generation to come. And that brings me to my summary of what I reflected from all the learnings that I've been doing. The first is S. So we can tailor it down to a SOAP practice, the stories. Was there any particular incident or story that caught your heart when you're on the field? Was there richness and value to the story? Is it worth documenting? Always observation. This is paraphrasing observation on your journal, looking around and documenting anything that may hold value, even though at that instance you may not feel it valuable, even if it's writing about something that you saw, the way that the door was colored, and it was common. And a common thing was about Egypt was they used to carry their cat to the workplace. And, you would think about why a cat? Why is the cat so important in the Egyptian lifestyle? It was important because they used to store wheat in a dome, which was infested with mice a lot of time. So this cat was taken to work. We all wish we could do that, but it was taken to work to reduce this mice incidence. So when you're observing, you are becoming more curious, and then you are looking about what are you feeling, what are the people teaching, or what are the people that you're with feeling? Have you encountered this in the past? What was your response or their response? So we ask a lot of questions and we try and connect the dots about it. The A is application. Consider what is working well in the context. How would you improve in them? How would you use the new knowledge, perhaps in finding new instructions or corrections? And how will you share this, create an action plan? And the last is, of course, people and participation. We cannot be a good practitioner of humanitarian surveying if we are not including the people and participating with them. So get people, get feedback, focus on the listening, and speak to your mentors and peers. And then use the different platforms that are available to reflect. We are really excited about the knowledge portal that we're hoping to come about in 2024, which will give our young surveyors a better community of getting connected and sharing these ideas. But because you will be the creators of this knowledge, you could choose your way of communicating. I know a few of my friends, they love TikTok, so they love making videos, but other of my friends are very shy, so they would go for more the oral and the written format. So what is your method of reflecting in a platform? Do you like text? Are you more of a journal person, or are you more of a video and sightseeing person? Which brings me to my final thank you for this session, and thank you, Prashni, for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Shedna. It was quite an interesting presentation with the history and everything attached to it. We're very grateful for you for that. So for the next, let me see, are there any questions here? There are none. So we'll just move on to the mentoring session. So everyone can move back to the landing page, and then you can open the session on the mentoring program where we'll all meet from here. Thank you very much.